Welcome to an MBA admissions masterclass with Fortuna. And as we have framed this in May, just 3 or 4 days since Harvard Business School announced their round 1, round 2 deadlines for September and January in the coming admissions cycle, we asked the question, is this your best chance to get a Harvard, Stanford, or Wharton MBA? Is this the year when it's the best chance in a generation to get into the M7? Now, why have we framed it that way? Pre-pandemic, all of the top schools had seen tremendous application volumes, numbers getting into school. And then, of course, that first wave of lockdowns, and everyone was thinking, hey, it's time to go to business school. But some of those dynamics have changed, and we'll be looking at those in detail with my 2 co-directors at Fortuna, Judith Silverman Hodara, the former Wharton Director of MBA Admissions, and Caroline Diarte Edwards, the former INSEAD Director of MBA Admissions. So with those gatekeepers and their perspectives on economic downturns and how that sort of plays out, we hope that the next 45, 50 minutes with you will be a wealth of insight to really help you to make informed decisions about, is this the year you're going to seize the day? You're going to go out and change lives and change the world, as Stanford likes to think about it, and go to a fantastic business school for a wonderful year or 2-year experience. So I'm at Simmons. Some of you will know me from the Centre Court festivals that we organise with poets and quants, but I'm very fortunate to work with an extraordinary team at Fortuna. We have over 40 former gatekeepers from the world's top business schools, from the M7, from what we then describe as the S7, so all of those top 10, top 15 US business schools, and then many of the top international schools, including, of course, INSEAD. I think I have 8 colleagues from INSEAD, and then London Business School. So I'm the one member of our Fortuna family that never worked in admissions, didn't even go to business school. I've got the t-shirt. Now, of course, my curious George says that he's going to Harvard, but I think getting to the gift store is as close as I will ever get. But
You're
I'm
too
a curious
modest,
one
Matt.
who asks questions of all of my colleagues, and they're incredibly patient with me to share so much tremendous experience that they have. So here are the panelists, and as I said, over the next 45 minutes, we're really going to take a deeper dive into that coming admissions cycle. The Wall Street Journal reported last week that they said employers were trying to keep their top talent. We know that it's a very tight job market, particularly in the US. But again, this idea that the M7, it could be your year. So this is the first of 3 masterclasses that we're running every Wednesday at noon East Coast. I guess that's what, 9 o'clock in the morning on the West Coast, and that might be just around midnight in Mumbai. And we hope that you'll be able to join us for those additional sessions, looking at other top schools and the various dynamics, strategies that you would need to make this your year. So just kicking off, I talked about a new season and that macro context. Expectation is that numbers might decline. But I think as you look a little deeper, clearly that US job market and employers trying to keep their top talent, we've seen that Gmat test taker numbers have dropped by as much as 25% in the last 12 months. Now, some of that slack will have been picked up by the GRE or the handful of top schools that have gone test optional for the last year. We're going to be talking about the impact of that. But still, changes in the White House administration 15 months ago had meant that on the international scene, we've seen numbers from India just shoot upwards. And Fortuna, of course, is a real reference for the industry. So what we see, and speaking to so many thousands of clients' inquiries every year, really does enable us to identify some of those China hasn't really come back yet, and that's even perhaps some of the geopolitical positioning that is going on. But if demand's going to be down, a school like Wharton caught everybody's breath with a 51.7% intake of women to the last MBA class. All the other schools want to achieve that sort of gender balance, and again, much broader diversity with underrepresented minorities. But they're going to fill those places in the classroom, and it could just be the levels of competition in the North American market will be very different. So stop and turn to the experts. And Judith, just you've seen through 11 years working in admissions at Wharton, the highs and the lows and the Lehman Brothers and dot-com bursts and bubbles. It's typically a counter cycle. Is that right?
It completely is a counter cycle. Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be with you today. And Matt, that is the greatest t-shirt in the history of all MBA t-shirts I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot of them in my 30 plus years of admissions. Yeah, it's a counter cycle. It's not surprising, but you kind of got to think about it for a minute, which is basically when the economy is doing really well, people don't want to leave their jobs and don't necessarily want to go to business school. But then when the economy is not doing as well, people also figure it's a good place to wait it out, right? So we've seen this before. We watched it. It goes like this. And when I was at Wharton, we definitely watched that happen many times over. Dot-com bubble and bust. Lehman Brothers, certainly. I remember that day incredibly well. We all looked at each other and were like, wow, hold on to your hats, because we were about to get a deluge of applications for the next cycle. And we knew that. And so a lot of people recognize that it's a good place to park yourself for 2 years and to really gain some skills. Some folks like to leave before the going gets really bad in the economy, and kind of ensure that they're going to have a place in an incoming class. But it is never surprising. And I guess what my feeling on it is it always takes a little while to recognize that it's happening, and then boom, it really happens. And so in my mind, that is why this is a particularly good time to be applying to business school. And as Matt said, this is like a once in a lifetime generation, possibly opportunity, given what we're looking at in terms of volumes of applicants. So completely agree with your assessment, Matt, on that point.
So, I mean, Judith, this is one of the biggest decisions that people will make. The doors that it can open, the opportunities to go and have that impact, this extraordinary network. We'll be talking about some of those different factors. I suppose I was wondering, as I listened to Goldman Sachs and others saying, oh, given supply chain, clearly announcements from the Fed and what's going to happen with interest rates, this word recession is being bandied around a lot. Could it be that there's even a strategy for round one, when volumes might still be lower in a tight job market, and then if things really do turn sour by the end of the year, that then people will head into round two? So there's, hey, get in for round one, just to sort of not then be part of a rush for those January deadlines?
Yes, and this is a two-part answer. We always tell students, apply when you're ready. So don't feel like you have to rush it. It's not a round one or never, but we have seen this before. And again, I know this sounds crazy, but if you're watching the Fed interest rates, it is going to impact what happens in the United States, and then, not surprisingly, globally. So I do think we are looking right now, we're mid-May. If you're thinking about applying to business school, getting an action plan together for September would serve you very well. You might decide you're going to apply to one or two of your top schools and maybe one or two of your mid-tier schools to kind of spread out the wealth a little bit, which is a game plan that we really appreciate and definitely encourage our students to think about. But you've got enough time now to both take the Gmat or the GRE and get applications going, for September without it feeling like a panicked rush. The other thing I'll say is that there's always going to be room for quality. So as Matt has often heard me say, Wharton, Harvard, and Stanford are round agnostic, which means they don't really care when you apply. They've got room for candidates both round one and two and three if needed for some schools. But again, this is a pretty unusual place that we're in right now, where we kind of see the pressure building, and in terms of applicant numbers. So now is kind of like, if you're looking at it like an ocean, you're still kind of got time to ride in the wave before the bigger wave is coming in back of you.
Right. Caroline, from the international perspective, schools like INSEAD, of course, that you know so well, and a one-year program that calculates a very different ROI. I mean, it's a great investment any year, but how have you sort of seen those different counter cycles play through, and how that might guide applicants' decisions?
Yes, well, when I took the role at INSEAD, when I joined as admissions director, one of the first things I did after I had sort of dug up my own admissions file and seen what the interviewers and the file reader had said about me when I was admitted to the program. It was quite fascinating.
Did you blush?
I was very surprised. I had one interview that I thought hadn't gone brilliantly, and I had an absolutely glowing review from that interviewer. So, it just goes to show that you never know. So I did spend some time sort of digging through the historical data of the admission statistics over the decades, right? It's quite fascinating. And it's a very clear correlation, as you said, between the economic cycle, an economic upturn driving a downturn in application volume. And that doesn't really pick up again until doesn't really turn around again until there's the economic cycle shifts again. So it's a very clear correlation. Of course, 2020 was a very interesting year because, as Judith said, normally with an economic cycle, it sort of changes slowly and it gradually has an impact on application volume. Whereas March 2020, we'll never forget, right? It was like turning on a tap. There was suddenly a deluge of people throwing their hats into the ring, applying to business school. And so, the cycle literally switched overnight, which we'd never seen before. But what I also observed when I was at INSEAD is that, with the cycle, and I think, we've seen that with the pandemic, there are people who are thinking about, okay, well, maybe I'll apply to business school sometime in the next, year to 3 years. And then when there's an economic downturn or, a shock like the pandemic, they all apply at once, right? So that triggers a surge of applications. And so what has happened is you've pulled forward your potential pipeline for 12 months time, for 2 years time, maybe even 3 years time. Some of those people who might have applied later on, that has all been pulled forward to one moment in time or one cycle. And so now I think schools are also seeing a bit of the hangover of the pandemic, where they have seen, that deluge that was triggered by the pandemic, and some of those people who might otherwise have applied now, but they, actually had the time on their hands in 2020 and 2021, and so they applied at that point. So, and I think it's already having an impact on schools. So what we've heard is that schools, for the entry starting this fall, they're already struggling with yield, right? And schools are clearing more people than expected from the wait lists because some people are hesitating about going off to business school because they're getting promotions, they're getting pay rises, they're getting great job offers with a strong job market. And I think, perhaps application volume also dropped towards the end of this current cycle, right? So maybe round 3 was smaller than some schools expected. I think that might have happened too. So I do think that this year application volume will be down. And as you've said, I think that is going to be more the case in round 1 than possibly later rounds, right? We do expect that there's going to be, we could be heading into recession in 2023. And if that does happen, then the cycle will shift again. So I do think that this year could represent, the best time in between, that pandemic high of 2020-21 and potentially recession in 2023.
Right. As the NASDAQ and the S&P 500 constantly remind us, selling at the top, buying at the bottom, timing the market is always so difficult. Is there any sense for either of you, given what we were seeing through round 3 and yield management all the way through to the intake in September? Some candidates will think, even within their own firms, those in the front office, those glamorous positions, they were the ones more likely to secure places in Boston, Philadelphia, Palo Alto, and there I am in the back office as a research analyst. Do you think their time has come, and that just with others looking the other direction, that there is this sort of pool, and that hashtag M7 for me, this could be their year?
Yeah, I do think that for some of the profiles where they may have been at a disadvantage for certain reasons, and it could be because it's a common profile in the pool, right? I'm another management consultant, I'm another back office investment banker, and there's lots of people with that profile applying in a context where the job market is very strong, and so fewer of those people feel motivated to apply right now to business school. That's actually the time when you should be applying, right? If you have that common profile, because you have less competition, which I think, as you say, is particularly important to keep in mind for people with that common background, that typical sort of feeder profile into business school.
Right, and from a diversity perspective, I mean, Judith Wharton, of course, is justifiably proud of bringing in the sort of gender balance that they achieved this year. But I mean, all of the top schools, whether it's on gender, other areas of diversity and inclusion, they're going to be looking for diverse talent beyond banking, beyond consulting, beyond software engineers. So they're all out there looking for very diverse talent.
Without a doubt. And I think that, when you're thinking about opportunity, that talent is going to come in a lot of different ways, right? And there are some things that are going to remain constant, right? So there's always going to be an interest in academic capability and in your scores and in your extracurriculars and in, your career trajectory. But there's also a lot, Matt, you mentioned earlier, Wharton has now a greater percentage of women enrolled in the program than they do men, they were the first school to do that. Other schools are, very much in the hunt, excuse me, for that as well. A lot more of students coming from non-traditional backgrounds. We actually just helped a young opera singer who's going to be going to CBS in the fall, has no a wonderful story, had no background in business, although she maintained and presented that she was her product, right? So she was marketing herself to get roles and to work with a company. And so lots of opportunity for people that aren't coming out of the traditional banking, consulting, tech. Additionally, lots of individuals that might have started in a field that didn't appear to have a connection with business to begin with, right? So lots of students that are coming out and curious about opportunities for the MBA. That doesn't mean, again, that there's not going to be that continued push from those three large industry pools, but without a doubt, and certainly some of this has to do with the 2+2 and deferred entry programs, students thinking about business school earlier in their academic careers and not necessarily thinking, I have to go sort of lockstep into one of these industries and to eventually attend. So from my perspective, the diversity is very much there. And it is, without sounding like we're saying the same thing over and over and over, there's going to be a lot of opportunity in round one of this year. We all know it, for people that are coming from feeder industries and people that aren't. And we could give you lists of folks that are just coming from backgrounds that in a million years you wouldn't have expected that they would be interested in business school or admitted, and they have been. So that's something that we've been very much
we're being followed by hundreds of people, and others will then be catching this on Fortuna's YouTube channel. Great to also have you with us. Send in your questions if they are of the quality of the first question we just had. It's a real zinger that looks at that hot job market and the fact that McKinsey and others are now hiring associates, with great starting salaries. So they're sort of saying, what's the value of the MBA? Have we placed too much emphasis on that first salary coming out of business school? I mean, Caroline, of course, there are great rewards. We see these extraordinary jumps that you can make coming out of the top schools, but it's more than that first position. I mean, the MBA is then setting you up, not just for that first job, but for the third, for the fifth position, levels of seniority opportunities that will then follow.
Yes, it's a very good point and a very good question. And that's why people are hesitating to head off to business school right now, precisely because they're getting those great job offers and promotions and salary increases and so on. So they're questioning whether it makes sense for them financially. I think it's really important to take a long-term perspective, and all of the studies that look at return on investment, whether it's in the short term or in the longer term, show that, especially if you go to a strong program, you will see quite an impressive return financially over time. And I think there's also a lot of unquantifiable aspects as well. I think that an MBA gives you the ability to change careers, not just when you come out of the MBA initially, but also at any point in your career, right? It opens doors that otherwise might have remained closed, and gives you a network of support that is a wonderful asset to have. So and I think it gives you the ability, in a context of uncertainty, right? And who knows what the job market is going to look like in 10 years time, right? Even in 5 years time, never mind 20 years time, when current people heading off to business school are coming to the ends of their careers, right? We don't know what the jobs will be even. So having the ability to reinvent yourself, I think, is incredibly valuable. And having that that solid foundation of skills, that means that you feel confident and you have the ability to tackle running any part of a business, right? You're not stuck in a particular function, whether it's finance or marketing, but you have the credibility and the confidence to tackle any challenge that comes your way. And so, I think that there is huge value in that in the long term, in a context where we will continue to go through economic cycles, right? And I've seen it myself. With my own peer group from INSEAD. I graduated in 2003. My husband's peer group from Stanford, GSB 98. People go through unexpected challenges. You sort of imagine that your career is going to be this sort of constant trajectory of progression over time, but it's not like that. It's often a roller coaster, and even for the best qualified people, and the most talented people, unexpected things happen. And so it's incredibly valuable to have that strong foundation, that credential, and that network of people who are willing to help you when you face an unexpected challenge. So I think I would really encourage candidates to take the long-term view and not just think about, oh great, I've got this extra $20,000 in my salary this year, maybe I won't head off to business school. Really, please do take the long-term perspective, because I think that it's a huge asset to have, and it will stand you in very good stead for the future.
One thing I wanted to piggyback on that Caroline just mentioned is and we're going to talk about this later, but when you start to research schools, don't just talk to current students, talk to people that are 5 years out, and talk to people that are like 10 to 12 years out. Because you're really going to start to see that is the long-term value that Caroline was talking about. Sure, you may get X when you graduate, and why should that number doesn't seem that much more than it might be right now. But if you look at the long haul or the long tail, and you'll see that impact is very long lasting. So although sometimes students will say, oh yeah, I talked to 5 current students and this is what I learned about Harvard, really go deeper than that. Do yourself a favor and see what those long-term impacts can look like. That's definitely something that I would recommend.
Right. Just on the financials, a couple of points, and starting, Caroline, for the international schools, INSEAD, LBS, that have seen such strong demand, certainly through 4 years of the Trump administration. The dollar is almost at parity with the euro. So INSEAD, IMD, well, there's always the Swiss franc, right? But across the euro and the pound, that US dollar goes a long way, and its impact similarly against whether it's reals or rupees or the RMB. Do you think that will sort of factor into people's calculations?
Yeah, I think it will benefit some of the European schools, right? It will mean that it will be more affordable, especially the one-year format of many of the top international programs. Already, it's a very compelling case financially, and a lot of people do go that route because it's less of a financial outlay. Initially, you are forgoing your salary for 1 year rather than 2, and living costs, et cetera, makes a big difference. So, schools like INSEAD always do incredibly well in studies of return on investment because, not least because of the 1 year format. And with the those currency fluctuations that you mentioned, yes, I do think that the international schools will benefit from that. So, so it may be that, whilst it may be that we see more of a downturn in the US domestic market than in the international market, with possibly schools like INSEAD, HEC, IE, etc., benefiting from that that currency situation over the next 12 months.
Right. And Judith, even as we think about round 3 or yield management now for September and perhaps how that might play through the following year, do you think that will have impact on financial aid? A lot of that has been sort of allocated to achieve the diversity that schools have placed so much emphasis on. But if they're fighting for candidates, could that influence the way that they approach financial aid in the next year?
So I just want to make sure I understand. You mean in round 3 financial aid, or sort of coming up for round 1?
Well, I suppose we have right now, and schools that say, no, join us in September and we'll actually, maybe put money on the table that wasn't available before. But how might that play through to next year and decisions that they make around financial aid?
So, certainly schools are anxious to nail down their classes. In many of the schools are releasing interview invitations to sort of the 2+2 and round 3 applicants now. They're going to get a sense of their yield very quickly because the third round tends to speed up. The volume's not there. And they are going to make sure that if they are not getting their yields, that they're going to do what they can to ensure that they've got some students that are, they can't go back and reissue funding to people that were already admitted, but they can certainly play a little bit of catch up, Matt, with round 3. And I do believe that will be the case. I also think that they're going to be keeping their eyes open, and they're going to want to lock in that talent very early in round 1 for next year. So they are also sort of steeling themselves against, like, we want to make sure that we get this person to be here. So let's sweeten the pot a little bit. And especially for diversity candidates. And that's sort of, to me, that's going to only intensify in the coming cycle. So it might not be enough money for someone to make a decision on, right? It might not, switch you from, oh, I'm going to go here, but XYZ is giving me 10,000. But for some students, that may be enough of a difference. So it doesn't have to always be a huge outlay of like a full ride, but it could be an indication that a school is very interested in you. And sometimes schools will add on to that, right, Matt? They'll give you access to, to the deans. They'll give you access to certain research or networking opportunities. So schools have gotten very savvy about how to let a student know that they really want them, and it doesn't all have to be financial. So lots of different pieces of that puzzle to consider. But I am fascinated by this topic, and I'm going to be looking at the round 3 awards very closely to see if schools are a little nervous about making sure they get their yields, as they really wrap up this year's class.
Right. I learned last week that one of the top 10 schools, there are professors at the school that are currently spending half of their time, not in the classroom, but talking to candidates that have been made offers. So the schools are rolling out the red carpet, and with everything that both of you have said, here's the crystal ball moment. As I look at the remainder of this year, and as we approach that 2022-2023 admission cycle, we're going to be looking at even impact on changing admissions. Are they going to sort of come up with new essays, videos? So is this the time to play with different techniques? And of course, how will the schools continue with Gmat and GRE waivers? Several of you have written with questions, but I think it's going to play across those 2 rounds. And those that apply in round 1, particularly from the US market, that white guy on Wall Street has probably never had a better chance than to get applying in September 2022. I absolutely adhere to Judith's comment about, apply when it's the right time for you. But if we do hit that recession, and a lot of the signs are there, then, Caroline's comment about, getting in before suddenly this big wave, because it does come in waves, and round 2 could be a real rush. Certainly, we're there to answer these questions, look at your profiles being ready, whether it's for September, January, or it could be for next year, to really make the right decision for you. Now, what goes into all of the decision-making and on that's where we're going to take you next, and what the schools are looking for. The fundamentals, Judith, we'll talk about Gmat and GRE later, but the fundamentals haven't changed. Those core factors. Just talk us through, what any of the world's top business schools is really looking for in a great applicant.
So I had been at Wharton for quite a number of years. And so my comments are sort of based on that experience as the acting director of admissions, and also in the students that we've been working with for about a decade at Fortuna. And there's some things that are constant, right? The academic ability. So no matter what you studied in undergrad, was it something that you were focused on? Were you performing? Were you taking classes that were challenging to you? Do you have the quantitative chops to be able to survive and thrive in an academically quantitative environment? And so certainly that transcript, the school record, is going to be a very important part of the review that goes on. In addition, is going to be your track record professionally. We talked a little bit earlier about not necessarily coming out of those feeder industries, but what are the steps that you've taken within the context of your career? Have you been mentoring individuals at this stage? Have you been working on a lot of teams? Have you been sort of, an integral part of the organization where you work? So more than just an employee, but is this something that you're really working to build and have an impact on? And so as schools review your resume, they're going to be looking for that certain kinds of keywords that are going to show to them that out of college, you were doing this kind of work and had these kinds of responsibilities. And then that increasingly over the past 3 to 6 years that you've really been growing in the ways that you're taking control of your own career narrative, and that you've been increasing not only in responsibilities, but in the ways that you're able to affect outcome. So that's certainly going to be important. Schools are going to want to see that, not surprisingly, that there are things that you care about outside of work. I know that is really, really tricky with COVID and 2 years of not being able to do much, but if you do have things that you're involved with, hopefully you'll be able to continue to engage with them moving forward. Lots of opportunities for those that are still not meeting in person, but you can, get involved online. And that definitely is a little bit of a hangover from COVID, admittedly, that schools understand that if you ordinarily were involved in an after-school basketball program for kids in your neighborhood, that wasn't happening. And a lot of people will spend their free time at work, parts of different affinity groups, working on recruitment for incoming associates and things, or mentoring, things of that nature. So there's not a magic extracurricular activities. It's not like working in a soup kitchen is looking better for you than playing rugby. Schools just want to see that what you bring, you're bringing your full authentic self to the program, academically, professionally, and extracurricularly as well. So those are all going to be important. And we're going to talk a little bit later on about the ways in which you can really strengthen your profile between now and those deadlines. But I would say that really, on paper, so many of the students that apply are really admissible to the schools that you're considering. And what's going to help you to really stand out in those schools are the ways that you're presenting who you are as an individual and what that narrative is going to be, which is why people like Caroline and myself, we really work with students very, very consistently and deeply to help them bring out those stories and those examples and those experiences that are really going to help to shape those other kinds of things that are set by the school's academics, professional, and extracurricular.
With all of those stories and experiences, Caroline, it's probably, it's still premature to talk about a world post-COVID. We're still only slowly emerging from the last 2 years, but anyone that's in the coming admission cycle will have been infected in some way, whether their particular industry, working in the airline industry, for example, remote working. It's had so many different impacts. This is something that the admissions office will be preparing itself for in the next sort of cohort of applicants.
Yes, that's right. And as Judith said, schools understand that your opportunities may have been affected by what has happened over the last 2 years. And we've worked with a lot of candidates who are very concerned about how the impact that it's had on their ability to do certain things, and especially extracurriculars and so on, how that will be perceived by the admissions office. But the schools, everyone's been through this, right? We've all been through this together. So the schools absolutely do understand the dynamics. And some schools actually have specific questions about, how has it impacted you? And what have you done during the pandemic? And so, I think it's important to show that rather than just having been sort of, passively affected by it, that you've also been proactive in taking opportunities, perhaps to help people who might need help, or to support colleagues who may be struggling with working in an online environment. It impacted people in very different ways. And so, some schools are actually specifically asking questions about, what have you done over the past couple of years to have some sort of positive impact. So, as we come out of that, I think about what stories you have, but also, now people are able to get back to, as you said, doing some more activities that might not have been possible beforehand. And extracurriculars are important. So, if you've got out of the habit, if you've left that basketball coaching team because, it all sort of fell apart in March 2020, see what you can do to get back to doing something where, you have a commitment and an ongoing activity that will show what sort of student you'll be. That's what the schools are looking for. Is they want to see that you're a well-rounded candidate who has interests beyond work and study, and they want to see what sort of student you're going to be when you get to the campus, and what sort of alum you will be. Are you someone who's going to be actively engaged in the network? So if your extracurriculars have slipped over the pandemic, that's perfectly understandable, but now is the time to get back to doing something if you can. And if you have had a hiatus in your extracurriculars, and you're looking at applying, especially if you're looking at applying in round one, I wouldn't suggest, starting something completely new. Suddenly, as you said, volunteering in the soup kitchen, if that's not something that you've done before. But try to pick up on something that's related to what you have done before, to show that it's something that is, a genuine interest and ongoing engagement, even if you have had a hiatus during the pandemic period.
Now, I'm always very lucky to sit down with both of you, with other colleagues from Fortuna. Also get to sit down with Kirsten Moss, the admissions director at Stanford, Chad Losey from HBS, Blair Mannix from Wharton, and many, many others. Around these issues that you're both describing, it's not, well, there's the line in my resume. It's then being able to share with the school, what does it say about adaptability? What does it say about innovative thinking? And this is a lot of our work at Fortuna, right? To then be able to sort of join dots and show, whether it was in the community, whether it was through the last 2 years of remote working, how these different sort of behaviors emerge, resilience, leadership. And Judith, that's a big part of then being able to show those different behaviors and characteristics to the admissions office.
100%. And I was talking to somebody yesterday who was a boulderer. She liked to climb. She was a surfer. She liked to boulder, and she liked to look at the stars. And I was like, this is a great story. Let me tell you why. And so we talked about, well, what does that say about her? What does it say about her ability to see a route up a mountain? What does it say about her ability to see things that maybe other people don't see? What does it say about her ability to be patient and to wait for opportunities, right? So really, I believe that the things that you choose to do professionally and outside of work and outside of school say a lot about you as a person, and really a lot about how you're going to be in a business setting. So if, it doesn't have to be, and I think sometimes students feel like, oh, I have to really do something that's great for my community, or I have to, I have to tutor kids, or I have to work in a hospital. It's informing how you see the world. And most people that do what Caroline, myself, and Matt do are able, that's why we're in this position, is that we like finding those paths. We love talking with students and saying, well, here are the ways that we see that you can really pull in those characteristics from what you do, and help show a school why that is relevant for who you are as an individual. And I'm just reflecting, I literally had this conversation yesterday afternoon, and I could see how she could pull in the threads from these 3 things that she loves and she's chosen. And what does that say about her? And it's completely matched up with what she does for a living, right? So, and how she imagines that business school is going to come into play with all of that. So
Right.
it's, the business schools are not looking for you to be anything other than what you actually are. And they're very interested to hear your perspective on how did that shape you as a person. And in effect, if you join their community or their town, or, I like to look at it like they're building this town and they're choosing their residents for the next 2 years or the next year. So they want to see what talents and skills and personal characteristics you're going to be bringing to that grouping and that town, if you will.
I know that with my colleagues at Fortuna, we place so much emphasis on enjoying and embracing this opportunity to apply to business school, stepping back after maybe 3-4 crazy years to really have this sort of gift of introspection, think about your story, choices that you've made, a path that you've taken. So here's our core. Now, we've also reflected, would there be elements of the admissions process that might change? We've had a great deal of sort of consolidation of applications in the last 2-3 years. Can you see, Caroline, as we do now emerge post-pandemic, that schools might start to play with the questions that they're asking, or even the formats in which they're looking to evaluate applicants?
Yeah, I do think we might see some changes this year because the schools really haven't had the chance to come up for breath right until now. So it has been such a crazy couple of years for them with the deluge of applications, but also, during that period, managing a very volatile yield. A lot of uncertainty about who was actually ever going to turn up on campus or who could turn up on campus, right, in those classes during the pandemic. And then as well as, all the challenges of actually, managing life on campus during COVID. So they've been under, tremendous pressure for a couple of years. And now finally things are getting back to some sort of normal. And so any changes that they had sort of at the back of their minds for the past couple of years would have been put, very much on the back burner because they just didn't have the bandwidth to process how to roll out a change and to manage that. So whilst things have been pretty stable for a couple of years, I do think that we may see some new questions, some experimentation come up this year. Possibly less likely with schools like Harvard and Stanford, who don't change things very often, right? Stanford has that iconic question that has been rolled out every year for about the last 20 years now. And seems to work very well for them. So possibly those schools, and HBS has already announced that they're keeping their essays the same for this year. But I think that we may see some innovations coming through from other schools. And what we have seen over the past few years is increasing use of video questions. And I think, that will only continue because the feedback that I get from the admissions officers at schools that do use these video questions is that they love those videos. It's a super useful snapshot of a candidate, and especially if they're not otherwise meeting the candidate in person, right? Some of the schools use alumni for interviewing, and so whilst they get very valuable feedback from the interviewers, the admissions committee themselves will never actually meet those candidates in many cases. So having a few snippets of video to actually observe the candidate live or recorded, but in sometimes an unscripted setting to see how they think on their feet. That is very useful input and can be very valuable to the admissions office. So I think that we may see more of those video elements coming through as well.
If Stanford still does have what matters most to you and why this year, we're going to have send Kirsten and her team a big old 20th birthday cake, right? And Judith, you always said, from Wharton, we envied them that question. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall with you as you were thinking about, what are the questions that reveal? Wharton has introduced this aspect of contributing to your community. It must have taken you a lot of thinking and nuance to find the most revealing questions.
Yes, and I'm smiling because I think that Wharton still hasn't gotten it quite as right as Harvard and Stanford. I remember So the GMAC conference, which is the big industry conference, is usually held in June, and all the schools would rally around each other before they went, and they would try to figure out what their questions were going to be for the coming year. And we would look around at each other. You know, there were like 15 of us on our committee. We'd say, like, we're intelligent people. How come we can't come up with anything nearly as, like, you know, on the mark as these two schools? So in my mind, you know, the Wharton question is definitely expanding a little bit. They want to know more about your contribution. It's no longer just, you know, what are you going to do here? And what do you want to do afterwards? But the schools generally are in two different camps, three if you count the creative, you know, the creatives. So there's generally like the who are you? What matters to you? Stanford asks, why do you want to go here? Harvard wants to know who you are. Columbia and Wharton are very pragmatic. And then if you throw in the NYUs, which have, you know, pick six or different kinds of video options or different kinds of what song really resonates with you, which I happen to love. You learn a lot about people by hearing their favorite songs. So Matt, myself, and Caroline were talking about this the other day, that we think that there was a hiatus on changing things up because everything else was changing, right? School was online for about a year. A lot of testing wasn't taking place, incredibly difficult to get students on campus to understand what the culture was like. So if you look at it like a science experiment, I think that some of the schools are going to move to change their end this year, change some of those essay questions up, just so they can see sort of, you know, their testing. It's always testing and testing and testing to see how you're going to get the best sense of who those individuals are. So again, we know that Harvard's not changing. We don't think Stanford's going to change, but I do believe that we're going to see some changes in some of those other schools that are represented, you know, in the M7 and the Matt, what are they called? The Fabulous Six? What's the other moniker that you call them?
So what have we got? The M7, and people have different opinions on what the M stands for.
Yes.
And then there's the S7 or the S10. I mean,
Yes.
How big should that group be? You could probably have the European 5.
Yes, I have no doubt.
They're all clusters of fantastic schools. So
and then I forgot to mention, of course, you know, the LBS and the and NCOD, which have many more questions than the US schools do, looking for different, you know, different kinds of really, really drilling down on certain parts of your career. So lots of things to think about. One word of advice for those that are listening is don't get completely freaked out if you're applying to like 6 or 7 schools, because you can group them, right? You can sort of say, well, these schools are asking about my general sense of being, and these schools are really asking me very direct questions. So I like to say, when you have a chance, look at all the schools, make a spreadsheet, and it's not as bad as you actually think it is.
Yeah, I mean, we very often may focus on 1 or 2 schools with the idea that will carry over to others, but as you say, sort of that matrix. Now, a very popular question was around the Gmat and the GRE. We're starting to see this change, and of course, through 2020 and that final crazy round for September 2020. Kellogg and other schools were all dropping test requirements. And then it carried through. You know, Sloan was a school that maintained a policy through the 2021-2022 admission cycle of, you know, optional testing. My question is, you know, is that disingenuous? If you've got 2 great candidates, both went to a junior Ivy League school with comparable GPAs, they're both working at a strategy consulting firm, a bank, or, you know, a successful software engineer. One is sharing a 730, 740 on the Gmat, or what might that be, a 328 on the GRE, and the other one doesn't have a test score. So Caroline, where do you see Gmat and GRE going? And also that very popular article that you wrote about how high test scores are, coming back from that. I've just given you a lot to answer.
Yeah, well, so as you said, you know, we saw schools becoming much more flexible due to the pandemic, when testing was so much more difficult, and most of the top schools have gone back to requiring tests. MIT, as you said, through the last cycle was test optional. On the undergrad side, MIT has just announced that they are now going to be requiring tests again, which they weren't for the last season. So I think it's quite possible that MIT Sloan may also go back to requiring tests rather than being the only M7 school that doesn't require them. So And I think, as you say, if one candidate has got a very strong GMAT and another candidate has no GMAT, it's not the only thing that they're looking at, obviously, right? I mean, schools really are looking at every aspect of your profile, and it would be very unusual that two candidates would have absolutely identical tracks in every way, right? So it's probably not the only thing that differentiates them. But it does show, that there is a strong correlation between the GMAT or the GRE and how people do academically on the program. And, as I said earlier, I was kind of fascinated to look through some of the data at INSEAD when I first started working at the school, and that was something else that we did a lot of analysis into, was looking at the different elements that we are examining in the admissions process, and then actually what are the outcomes? How do people do during the program? How do they do when they graduate? And actually, I came into the school having done the GMAT myself, obviously attended the program, and then a couple of years later coming back to work as admissions director, and I was very skeptical about the value of the GMAT, but the data is there. There is a strong correlation between how people do on the GMAT and how people do academically, right? And it makes sense. The GMAT was designed specifically as a test for business schools, right? The GRE is broader. It wasn't specifically designed for business schools, or it does measure many of the same skills, but the GMAT is very business school specific. And so there is value there. Especially when you've got a very diverse pool of people coming from very different academic backgrounds, as you may have at a very diverse school like INSEAD or London Business School, some of the other international programs. So I think that if you're aspiring to apply to a top school, you should definitely be planning on taking one of these tests. I wouldn't count on MIT remaining test optional. We'll see, but I think there's a big question mark there. A lot of the other programs beyond the very top schools are maintaining test optional, right? And I think that's probably likely to continue. It just gives them more flexibility to encourage people to apply who might not have had the chance or the time to jump through that hoop. And it does take, it's a significant investment of time, right? Most people do have to spend a few months preparing if they really want to do as well as they can on the GMAT or the GRE. So it's definitely not for the faint-hearted, right? I mean, it's not much fun. I well remember myself having to, come back and slog through practice questions in the evening when I was, already exhausted after a full day at work. So it's not easy. And so, it's definitely something that you want to anticipate as far ahead as you can and get out of the way before you dive into the application process.
Judith, just to finish on tests and their continued impact in this whole process. I was doing a panel with Stanford at the NASDAQ Center, and Kirsten said, I think Stanford's GMAT averages are too high. The audience was like, what? what did Stanford? I think it was like it was at 738 that particular year. Caroline's great interview with Virginie from INSEAD saying, don't count yourself out. If you've got 660s, 670s compared to our school average of 70, we're still looking at you. And that's the message. I can sometimes understand candidates being a little skeptical. Well, like they're bound to say that, but that was the case, right? You no longer work in the Wharton office, so you can speak freely, Judith. You were looking at so much more.
I feel like I'm in a witness protection program. I can speak with immunity. There's so many other things that they're looking for. I hate to say it, but a perfect score is not that interesting. It's nice, but there's a lot of them. So honestly, the schools don't want to fill their classes with people that are only really good at taking tests or have 4.0 undergrads. I think that there's so many other interesting parts of everybody's background and experiences that makes them unusual. So I'm not saying that means you can walk in with a 610, but I'm definitely saying don't count yourself out, because there's more to you than whatever you did in that 3 hours of your life. And I think that I know that schools from experience are very much aware of that. And yeah, there's a lot of pounding of tables and gnashing of teeth and getting up at 11 o'clock and walking around the admissions table and coming back and, humping like, to fight for a candidate. At least that's what I recall from our days eating Chinese food very late at night at Wharton as we were going through the applications. But it's because people that are in admissions really are on your side. They're not looking for reasons to deny you. They're looking for reasons to admit you. So without overstating, the test is just part of it. And yes, you should prepare. And yes, you should take it seriously. And yes, you're going to take it more than once because nobody does well their first time out of the gate, pretty much universally. But keep in mind that if you're introducing yourself to somebody you're sitting next to at a bar or in a coffee shop, you're not going to blurt out what your scores are the first time you meet them, right? There's lots of other interesting things that you want to share. And that's really what the schools are looking for.
I think that curious George going to Harvard, he needs to make the t-shirt that just quietly says, 740 and maybe indicates a quant score because, they do look at the breakdown, but someone that's written and said, well, between 740 and 770, of course, 770 shines a little more. But if you were about to then spend the next 60 hours in the coming 3-4 months to nudge that score another 10 or 20 points. Think about how you could use that time, with Caroline and Judith talking about habits of leadership and impact, contributions in the community. That's an opportunity cost. So, hey, that 740, I think that's probably something that can use. And the reality is that, we are now, 120 days to Harvard Business School's round 1 deadline. That's plenty of time to put together a really compelling story. But what are those next steps? And perhaps you can both talk us through. And from there, with some of these great questions that have come in, maybe we'll have like a quick fire Q&A session at the end, get through some of those questions. And of course, people can follow up with us afterwards. But perhaps starting with you, Caroline, just in terms of some of the next steps.
Yeah, so as you say, now is the time to really start planning out sort of week by week and possibly even day by day what you need to do between now and the deadlines, because it is time to get serious. So if you're looking at round 1 and you haven't taken the test already, then that's definitely, I think, should be your first priority. I think for most candidates, it's ideal to take the test if you're taking the test before you then dive into the written application, because it can just be hard to juggle everything at the same time, right? When you've already got a demanding day job, no doubt. So I would definitely encourage candidates to get their testing out of the way first, if possible. And then, an important step at this stage is to also be thinking about who your recommenders will be. And, I advise candidates to have at least 3 people in mind at this stage who could be great advocates for you, because things can happen at the last minute, right? Someone may get sick, they may, for whatever reason, not be available to submit when the time comes. So it's good to have in mind at least 3 people and begin to have conversations with them, all right? And I think a great way to initiate that discussion and sort of gauge their willingness to really be a champion for you is not to just ask them, would you be my recommender? But to ask them, to phrase it a bit differently and gauge their reaction and tell them that you're applying to business school and ask them if they would be willing to advocate for you, right? You phrase it in a different way to sort of gauge whether they're really going to be someone who is going to say great things about you, really be your champion, really be on your side, and be willing to invest themselves in the process. And so, I think at this stage, it's good to start to have those conversations. And if it's someone perhaps that you haven't been in touch with for a while, right? So it might be a former boss who you haven't been in touch with for a few months or longer. So you don't want to be sort of springing this on them a few weeks before the deadline. So you should be sort of cultivating those relationships at this stage.
And then in terms of maximizing the 120 days, I think we published the 100-day countdown. So if you've got exactly 20 days to read that countdown and then put it it into practice. But in terms of research and school outreach, Judith, I mean, I'd love to head off to the West Coast and visit Stanford in July, but there won't be many students around. What can we do? Campus visits, but just connecting perhaps with students, alumni, the admissions. What would you recommend for effective research of the schools?
So the first thing, obviously, after this call, everyone's going to go online and sign up to start receiving updates from the schools that you're interested in, and find out when there are going to be larger scale meetings, online opportunities. Affinity groups often will have, hey, women's groups are going to meet and we'll tell you about what it's like to be a woman in business school, or this cultural background, that cultural background, this affinity group. Definitely, get connected with those. Schools really have check boxes for, I'm interested in learning more about X, Y, and Z. You're going to want to start to use your network on LinkedIn, talk to some current students, reach out to people, as I mentioned earlier, 5 and 10 years out, set your Google alerts to look at faculty members that you might want to study with, interested in finding out more about them. Essentially, you're going to start to learn this language. And I reckon it a lot. And I say it's a lot like learning a foreign language, because you want to start to immerse yourself in what do they say about things? How do they call their small groups? What do they call their lecture sections? Who are the faculty members that I might want to study with? And so there's some very practical things that you're going to be doing that Caroline mentioned. And I really look at the summer like a summer immersion in business school culture. So you're going to start to understand what sets Dartmouth apart from University of Virginia, from Wharton, from Columbia, and in your own mind start to say, hey, this really appeals to me, or I'm much happier in a smaller environment. So that's kind of what I like to see happen at the start of the 120 days. Do yourself a favor. Don't be afraid of looking at the application. It's no great mystery. Print it out, see what they're asking you. You don't want to be scrambling at the last minute to fill all of the stuff in. And the more you know, although it's a little overwhelming in the beginning, it'll start to feel much more manageable if you know what you're up against. So the schools are all going to ask you for salary history, job descriptions, responsibility, start to get some of these things together. Some of applying to business school is incredibly administrative, right? You're working on a resume, you're getting things lined up. And then some of it, the good part, I'm biased, but the good part is the introspective part. So while you begin to get to know your schools and to shrink that applicant pool as much as you can in your own mind, so it really is tailored to your interests and your focus, you also want to start to manage the process as well. And I like to set this up 120 days. You're really going to be ready to roll with getting things, in place by the beginning of August. So that to me is the month that you're kind of tying up the bows and making everything look good. But up until then is your introspection and also your immersion in what the schools are all about.
Right. So of course, Judith had everyone going onto those websites. I'm going to take everybody, before you sign up on the Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, Chicago Booth, Kellogg, Sloan, Columbia Inside, LBS websites for all of those affinity groups. Those are fantastic ideas. Of course, LinkedIn and finding individuals, maybe perhaps with common interests. Talk to us. For over a decade, the initial conversations. We are. I have to say this. We are the gold standard in the industry. People say, I've talked to several firms, but I got nothing like the level of insight and input, advice, support, enthusiasm, guidance. You can see from Caroline and Judith and the rest of the team. So, do reach out. Each of your stories is individual to you. We'll have more of these sessions where we'll be breaking down on a school by school basis through those MBA admissions, masterclasses, and all of those resources. There is an extraordinary amount of resource that Fortuna has put together on the YouTube channel, on the site, blogs for every school and every aspect of the application process. Now, I had promised with some of the great questions, and I was seeing so many questions coming in, I was thinking, wow, how are we going to get through all these? I'll do a couple of quick ones and then remind myself of some of the earlier questions. Everything that we've said, Caroline, for the MBA, and the year ahead, do you think it's equally true for the Masters in Management, for exec MBAs, that the same sort of dynamics are at work?
Well, with the full-time programs, yes, but less so with part-time modular formats like the executive MBA. So whereas the full-time programs tend to be counter-cyclical, That's not the case for part-time modular programs where people are usually working at the same time as they're studying. So in that case, they don't have the issue of leaving their jobs and turning down great opportunities necessarily. So whilst we may be going into a downturn in application volume for full-time programs, that's probably not the case for part-time programs like executive MBAs.
And well, you talk about, of course, part-time programs and these different delivery forms. We are seeing more hybrid and online programs. Mr. and Mrs. Attendee had a child, and they gave him or her the first name Anonymous. So Anonymous Attendee wants to know and has asked us a handful of questions, but one of them was just,
Awesome.
where are we going? Do you think that we'll see increasing store and value, Caroline, placed on the online MBA and these hybrid models?
I think it will become more common and more accepted as, so much has switched online during the pandemic. It really accelerated the digital transformation in so many areas. So I think that more people will go in that direction because they've become much more comfortable with doing so many more things and engaging online in a way that people didn't necessarily do pre-pandemic. So it's definitely, given a huge boost to online programs. I would encourage people to look at, at least at hybrid formats, because I do think that it's still difficult to build the same quality of relationships in a purely online format. Compared to how you can do that when you're actually in a room physically with people. So there are some great hybrid formats out there as well. So, I would think very carefully about doing a purely online program, because in the longer term, when you speak to MBA graduates, a big part of the value that they get out of the program in the longer term is the network and those relationships that continue to pay dividends decades down the road, in the same way that maybe the knowledge that they learn in the classroom is not necessarily still as relevant, but it's the relationships that are really generating a lot of value. And so you need to think about whether you're going to get that same quality of network out of an online format.
Right. The two of you co-authored an article 2-3 years ago, I think, on Forbes, on Poets and Quants, about over 30s applying to business school. Now, that article has been read by over 285,000 people. There are lots of over 30s. We didn't all decide at the age of 25, hey, I'm off to business school to get my MBA. And, as we think about the upcoming year, for some, that perhaps the clock is ticking. But Judith, just talk us through, over 30s. The schools are looking at them just as seriously as others, but do they have to be a little bit more specific about their career goals or anything, that they then really want to bear in mind?
I would say that if you're over 30 and applying to business school, you definitely have, you're in the pool. You definitely have as much opportunity. Schools want to make sure that you're employable after graduation. So I would say you want to be fairly thorough and direct about where you envision yourself going. You may not say, well, I'm going to do this, and if that doesn't work out, I'm going to do that. You definitely want to research the kinds of firms or organizations that you might be looking to do a summer internship with, right? So at 30 plus, you've had, 8 or 9 years of experience at that point. Schools are going to want to understand what your perspective is. Why is it that you're not necessarily applying to an EMBA? So, and nor do I think any of these things are a negative. I'm just sort of putting it out there. Be prepared to answer that pretty head on. Through my 8 years of experience, I've learned about leadership. I've learned about teamwork. I've learned about this particular industry and function. My MBA is going to help me career pivot because I find that much more interested in healthcare and I want to do this at that, so the specificity can be very helpful, but 100%, given all the things that we've just been talking about, being over 30 is you're still very much in the application pool for the schools that we're talking about today. Not at all a problem, just something that you want to make sure that you talk about up front in your application.
Right. We've talked about perhaps how a lot of less traditional backgrounds might be entering the pool this year. They see it as a great chance for them. But our question comes from someone whose bachelor's was more on the arts side, doesn't have a particularly strong quant background. So the Gmat, the GRE would be a demonstration. Caroline, do you think taking additional courses are also good in the eyes of the admissions office?
Well, I think, if you do well on the GMAT or the GRE in the quant side, then that is sufficient, right? If you haven't got a strong academic quantitative background and that doesn't come through much in your work experience, then you do need to make sure that it comes through strongly in some aspect in your application, right? Because they do need the reassurance that you are not going to struggle with those core courses. So if you've done well on the quant test in the GMAT or the GRE, then I don't think you necessarily need to worry about doing any other courses. But if you're still concerned that maybe your performance is sort of average on those parts of the test, but not outstanding, then it could be helpful to do some additional courses. But beyond that, you might want to do some additional courses in any case for yourself to help you prepare for the program, right? And many students do extra prep courses just in order to be able to hit the ground running when they get to school. So you might not necessarily need it for your application, but it might be something that you want to do before you get to campus.
Okay. Judith, this one perhaps for you. We have a number of the Fortuna team that are real aces working with the 2+2 deferred enrollment applicants. And if it's going to be your senior year in college, it's your senior year in college. So that could be for the coming cycle. Do you think there's any specific advice you would give those considering those deferred applications in the coming cycle? Is volume going to change, or does that kind of remain stable because you finish college when you do?
I think that is going to continue to rise. We've seen it. When I was at Wharton, there was really only a deferred entry. It was not called the MOLIS program. It was called submatriculation. It was for students that were currently enrolled at Wharton and were going to continue their Wharton degree. So there was not that gap. Harvard famously had the 2+2 program, but a lot of other schools have gotten on the bandwagon. It's a fabulous way to lock in talent, right? You're sort of saying to these students that might have considered law school, we really are interested in you. Go and do whatever you want for 2 or 3 years and then come back. And so they're kind of encouraging students to get connected to the programs earlier. They're coming out, excited about going to business school and recognizing that they have a little more flexibility and fluidity in what they may choose to do in that interim time. So I personally think that that's going to be the next great frontier, so to speak, for applicant numbers. I also think that schools are going to find out very interesting ways to combine these with joint degrees. So perhaps there's going to be a deferred law MBA or a deferred med MBA. Granted, this all puts a little bit of time on the back end, so people may be older when they're actually, enrolling. But I think that these numbers and these programs are only going to continue to grow in their actual opportunity. And then I think, I could be wrong on this, but I think in their complexity as well. So opportunities that are being offered to students that might, again, go the deferred entry route.
Right. In the last decade with Fortuna, Caroline, our clients, not just tremendous success rates at the top schools, but they've been awarded tens of millions of scholarship dollars. And that's always been so wonderful to see. Perhaps trying to time some of the questions about how those scholarship decisions are made, great applicants and how that could affect a scholarship decision. You were actually, making those final decisions versus perhaps different parts of their demographic, a test score that could also influence. Just talk us through some of perhaps the bigger threads that were then being made in the admissions office and questions around financial aid.
Right. Well, so there are different types of financial aid. There's merit-based aid, and then there's pure financial aid where it's really just based on financial need. So merit-based awards may be made at the time of admission, and it's really where the school is looking to, as Judith talked about earlier, make sure that they secure that candidate, and they are aware that candidate may be getting offers from other schools and as well as scholarship offers from other schools. And so the schools are often in competition for the very best candidates, and so they will use scholarships to help to sort of sweeten the deal and secure that candidate. And I think that, as we talked about earlier, Wharton really made a splash with shifting to just over 50%, 51% women, and other schools are chasing that goal as well, trying to reach gender parity. And so I think that it's a very good time to be applying as a woman to business school. And I think that, some of the merit-based awards and scholarship awards might go disproportionately to women in the next, especially in the next season. If there is a downturn in application volume, there will be even greater competition for those great women candidates. And then otherwise, it varies by school, and the schools do publish a lot of information about the scholarship processes and financial aid, and it does vary, and so I would encourage people to spend some time reading up on the different processes at the different schools, so that you know what the opportunities may be for you. But often there will be a combination of an application where the candidate, where the school will be looking at whether that candidate is a good fit for the criteria for the scholarship, and whether they actually have financial needs, right? And they will be looking at the financial background of the candidate, what they've been earning, what savings they have, what financial commitments they have, if they're supporting family, and so on. So the schools take it very seriously in trying to spend that money very wisely and support people, and they really do want to make it feasible for people to pay for the program, right? They once someone's been admitted to the program, they want to make sure that they actually can manage the financial commitment as well. And so schools are really trying very hard to support candidates in that. So I would say, my advice is you do your research, because it does vary a lot by school, and there are a lot of different scholarships that you can potentially qualify for, and that's something that you need to look at, see where which scholarships are the best fit for you. And apply early, because sometimes scholarships go earlier in the season rather than later.
Right. So Tejas, with your 760, but worrying if a quant 48 is an Indian may reach out to us and let's talk about it. Jacob, same thing. Professional qualifications, can they be rated as equivalent to a degree? Get in touch with us and we will talk that through with you. The strategy sessions that we offer, we take them incredibly seriously. Judith, with Caroline, with other colleagues, we're talking about Model UN and how it joins dots with perhaps something you've then been doing at a Big Four. And some years later, we find out the musical instruments that you've played, the passions that you have, but and that's important with the sort of discussions that we're then trying to have to really help you in your next steps. Now, I hope that today's masterclass, as we look at the upcoming admission cycle for 2022-2023, has been helpful to try and find that document with the 100-day or the 120-day sort of timeline, everything that you can be thinking of. Starting with Harvard, they normally have the first round one deadline. I think it's on September the 8th this year, and then Stanford, Wharton, and other schools in the days and the weeks that follow. But do reach out so that we can, share such great experience and insights from my colleagues. And join us next Wednesday. We'll be doing another MBA Admissions Masterclass series. But for today, I want to thank both Caroline and Judith, and to all of you for joining us, for coming up with so many great questions, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon.